Chapter 1. August's mother refused to name him before his birth. There remained this gentleness still to the child growing in her womb, a hushed quality that kept her from pinning her hopes on it. She would not name the baby until it was squirming in her arms. Her daughters did not understand this, or at least Ozamaka and Chinyere did not. The youngest, Peculiar, was too young to understand or not understand. She simply walked in her sister's footsteps and repeated the questions they asked. It wasn't something their mother could explain to them. She did not want them to worry. She herself worried sometimes when her faith faltered. On those occasions, she read herself the letter she received from Kaduna, sitting in the darkness of her room. To her right, the curtain is drawn as though if she let light fall on the brown paper, it would crumble into dust in her shaking hands. Dearest sister, you will have a son, and it shall not kill you. I dreamt of your blessing. God is always faithful, and his word says, of whose report shall we believe? Have faith. Her sister's letter did not make her heart impervious to her doctor's warning. She still remembered the way he pointed at her. Mrs. Akasike, I hope you heard me. Don't try again. Don't at all. You will not survive it. Take care of the ones God has given you. But the letter made her feel as though she had God's very own grace behind her, and with that came a sort of courage. A courage that eluded her husband. I'm afraid, he told her once, his head resting on the roundness of her stomach. They were in the living room, she lying sideways on the couch so that her protruding belly was resting on the cushion. Him sitting on the floor in nothing but shorts, rubbing her stomach gently. The children had already retired to their rooms, and an old episode of Checkmates was playing on TV. She loved his belly rubs and the way his whole face would light up when he felt the baby move. It's just pregnancy, she said, laughing. When he kissed her stomach, rubbed his cheek against the warmth of her belly, she said, God will make a name for himself. I trust in him. August grew up thinking his mother brave, though foolish. It was one of those things he never said out loud. A thought he allowed himself only in the privacy of his own mind. He knew how sad it would make his sisters, how they would repeat it to one another, whispering, making sure their whispers were loud enough for him to hear. Did you hear what August said? Did you hear? Their heads would be shaking morosely from side to side. Sometimes, when August said or did something his sisters thought unacceptable, they told him a story about his mother to make him sufficiently remorseful for what he had done, what she had sacrificed for him to live. August gathered all those stories, nursed them until they were ingrained in him, almost memories of his own. He knew the folds of his mother's skin, the round immunization scar on her right shoulder, the contours and ridges of the stretch marks that danced outwards from her navel in slender lines. Even the way her voice broke when she cried. He knew his story too, every bit of it, every detail of every event. He could trace the defiance in his mother's face as she sat in the car, almost 2 months before her due date, trying to breathe deeply and evenly. The more he ruminated on these memories, the more he was enveloped with pangs of incompleteness, and almost something he should feel that he never would, someone he knew enough to love but never met. She would have been alive were it not for you, he sometimes thought to himself. August was named by the nurse who cared for him the morning he was born. She picked the name for its promising meaning, awe-inspiring, majestic, venerable. But August Akasike at birth was none of those things. Knowing that August's mother had no son and had been told by the doctor not to have more children, The nurse saw him in an almost heavenly light. When she held him, his pale yellow skin tan and scratching, he appeared to her to be the most glorious baby she had ever held in her hands. As dawn approached, the rain thundering heavily outside, August's father was nowhere to be found. The way August's sisters related the story of their father's disappearance, the way Ozamaka clicked her tongue and Chinyere sighed, we waited and waited and waited for him. August could have sworn he knew, even as a baby, that he had been abandoned. Stories had that effect on him. They possessed him over and over until they stopped being mere stories and his mind drew up urgency and emotions and tears. By the time he was 7, it was almost impossible for August to imagine that he did not bear conscious witness to them. Each time he saw his father, each time the man refused to look him in the face, August remembered that night, that emptiness of space where his father's body should have stood. The night preceding August's birth, the rain thundered down so heavily on the streets of Enugu that one could barely hear oneself speak. When he was 7, August dreamt each night of rain, hard, violent rain, and woke up to paralyzing pain in his thighs. Sometimes, on the nights he saw his mother's shadow looming somewhere in the showers of rain, he felt the pain in his arms too. The doctors had no idea what was wrong with him. When he woke up in tears, his sisters were assembled in his room, their voices low so as not to wake their father. They massaged his aching muscles, and Uzamaka told him a story from when their mother was alive, because she knew how stories of her calmed him. It could be the most mundane of things. An afternoon, their mother fed Chinyere ice cream as the hairdresser styled her hair into painful braids. Or the day she lost her footing and fell just outside their compound. Or the day she drove to Uzamaka's school to scold the headmistress. August loved that story because of how much it animated his mother. It was the only memory he had of her where she quarreled. He liked to imagine that it was him she defended like that. Because she knew he loved that story, Ozamaka told it many times. She was in primary 2 and her teacher had flogged her for losing her pencil. Their mother was furious. They drove to the school that afternoon and caught the teacher just before she left. The bewildered teacher was sitting at her table, doing up her makeup. She stood to her feet when she apologized, as though that would calm August's mother. But the apologies fell on stubborn ears. "My sister," the teacher called August's mother. "My sister, you know how careless you children can be." "Don't sister me," August's mother was shouting. The headmistress heard the noise and came to intervene. And so, their mother turned her fury on the more authoritative figure. "How do you flog a 6-year-old because she lost a pencil? What is wrong with you people in this school?" their mother asked. When Uzamaka shared this detail, she pointed the way their mother had pointed, index fingers sticking out straight, the thumb above it pointing up, the 3 fingers below it slightly curved. August practiced keeping his hand that way, and when he did, it made him feel as though he was there, standing timidly in the safety of his mother's shadow as she went to war for him. The stories distracted him from the pain, and even then, his sisters would stay till he fell asleep again. Later, after a doctor at the teaching hospital at Itukozala laughed at him and said, "It's nothing serious, it's just growing pains." The pain stops on its own, no? The dream stopped, and with them, the pain. For a long while after, August felt guilty for keeping his sisters worried all those nights for something that wasn't serious. Just his body visiting him with a bit of the pain with which he arrived on this earth. August's mother, and August knew this, had screamed and screamed the night before he was born. The furious rain made it hard for her screams to reach far past their car, but her voice reverberated, branding fear into the hearts of everyone inside the car. August knew the pitch of those screams. He knew how scared his sisters were. He remembered his own fear, or something of that nature, which he imagined for himself. He remembered, too, the hardness of his father's face as he made it through the traffic. In August's memories, there was a benevolent angel of death whispering in his father's ears, the way benevolent spirits warned bereaved people of their loved ones' deaths in the face of dire illness or other such insurmountable circumstances. He knew his father had not sealed his heart for this eventuality, and so it broke him when it happened, damaging him as badly as a man could be damaged. August knew all these things. What he didn't know was how he was born. In the matters of August first, Ozamaka was the central authority, but even she was unsure. All she knew was that their mother went into a curtained room and screamed and screamed and screamed until her voice died. A whittling fire on a cold Harmattan night. And after that, there was only silence. Long, pressed silence that stretched and stretched until the angel of death came for them too. "You came in the morning," his sister told him once. "Some hours before Daddy returned, they put you in my hands, just for a few minutes. August, you are so beautiful." But August knew that part wasn't true. He had read all the medical reports and heard them say it. He was yellow, a sickly kind of yellow. He was tiny and had cracked skin. There were many things remembered the doctor saying to his father: elevated bilirubin, neonatal jaundice, malnourished. He cherished those reports because they gave him something his sisters didn't have. Memories his sisters' stories didn't bet. He sometimes imagined his father ran away after, not before, he saw him, with his skin looking as though it would peel right off his bones. He imagined the man took one look at the sickly baby that killed his wife and ran. August's birth broke his father. It somehow robbed him of the strength to continue living. The man August grew up knowing to be his father was a ghost for whom life held no more surprises or disappointments, no pain or happiness. When his sisters discussed this, when they talked of their father way back when he still cared, when he was still the type of man who picked up his children and tickled them, they made sure to absolve August of guilt. If only death did not take mommy, they said. Death is wicked, so cruel. But August knew. So vast was he in the art of knowing, in the skill of unwrapping his sister's words until he discovered the truth they never admitted to themselves. Before his birth, August's father was a happy man who clicked his tongue at the mere suggestion of a second wife. "Oh boy," he would say to his friends when they made the suggestion, "You want to break my home? You want to put me at loggerheads with my God and my wife? Though I'm not even sure what the difference is some days." Then he would laugh, the sound of his laughter saturating the air and squashing all the scents. When his wife told him about the prophecy, he laughed too. His laughter was always his weapon. His laughter was always his answer, the weapon with which he fought the world. "Look at the letter my sister sent me from Zaria," she said. She placed the letter on the mattress. "Are you actually serious?" he asked her. "You've not even looked at the letter. It's from Amara. I don't care if it's from Abacha. This is foolishness." His wife buried her face in her hands and began to cry. He stopped, sat back down on the bed and put an arm on her back. "Come on now, it's not a crying matter," he said, rubbing her back gently. He had always felt great powerlessness in the face of her tears. "Why must my own be different?" she said. "What sin have I done that God would deny me a son?" August's father wanted to hold his wife, to console her, but he did not want to water the seeds of hope in her mind. I don't care what people say, he told her. He was lying. He remembered the letter his mother sent him, telling him how people were calling him a weak man who could not father sons. Why else would an only child not remarry? It had bruised him, especially because he knew his mother could not write. She had dictated that letter to someone else. Still, he spoke the lie because it was a good lie. I don't care, he said. Don't listen to what people say. We have 3 beautiful girls. You want to die and leave them for who? For what? August's mother had a point to prove, a duty to fulfill, and so August came. The morning of his birth, August's father knew, even while running about trying to save his wife, that he would never forgive himself if she died. They told him there were too many complications facing both baby and mother. She lost so much blood that the blood the hospital had in its blood bank was insufficient to see her through her surgery. He called just about everyone he could think of. He drove to Apuke to pick up a colleague of his whose blood ended up being too low to donate. Then he continued calling. We have notified our contacts too. Hopefully we'll find a donor in time, the doctor said. If he could have given his wife all the blood in him, he would have. But their types did not match. He would have offered his children as donors too, but he knew that blood types matched his. A positive. Later, when he learned that August was O positive like his mother, he would break down and weep at the irony. The cold, cruel irony. He had just arrived with the 4th person who could maybe save his wife's life, his own life, a friend of his wife's who swore to be O positive when they told him his wife had died. Bled out on the table. No one's fault, they swore. The surgery most likely would not have saved her anyway. At first, August's father got in his car to get air, to get away from the stench of disinfectants in the hospital. Then he drove from the hospital down through the landscaped street of GRA. The rain had stopped, and in this place was pitch silence, punctuated only by the sound of his own breathing and the car engine. He drove all the way to their home on 6th Avenue. He turned the engine off, and resting his head on his steering wheel, he wept. He had never known loss like this. Loss so encompassing he was fighting the knowledge itself, knowing what it would do to him. He did not immediately return to the hospital. He did not want to see his children. He did not want his children to see him broken like that. It took him long hours sitting alone in the noise of his own tears to gather himself. Yet, back at the hospital, when he looked down at August, all tiny and shriveled, possessed with such tragic beauty, he bent over the boy and sobbed again. Uzamaka hugged her father's waist, and it made him more inconsolable to realize how much his children needed him, and how uncertain he was that there was any of him left to give. August stayed in the hospital for 10 weeks before it was safe to take him home. When he was brought home, it seemed as though the stream of visitors would never stop. They brought gifts with condolences, and Ndo sitting next to a praise Master Jesus. Sympathies offered with congratulations. August's paternal grandmother danced, quite happily. She never cared for August's mother and was happy her only son now had a son of his own, someone to carry on the family name. Afame Fula, she called him. What sort of name was August anyway? What kind of a silly person named a child after a month? Afame Fula Akasike. The name never stuck and never made it onto his birth certificate. After August's grandmother died, the name was forgotten, but his spirit never left August. He sometimes felt it, heard it in the voice of his mother. You must bear this name, the voice seemed to say. You must carry on the blood of your father and his fathers before him. No one else would do this if not you. Sometimes it made sense. Most times it didn't. But so much had been sacrificed to carry this name, to preserve it for the sons who would follow. Once, when August was barely 6, his grandmother told him this, that he had to bear this responsibility as carefully as he bore his own life. You live not just for yourself, Afam. You live for us all, for our Kasike. Always remember, she said. That was the year before she died. August never liked her much. On the day of her funeral, he did not cry. At first, when he saw the commotion, the old wrinkled women rolling on the floor with their skin tall, the old men shouting in hoarse voices, he wanted to cry, but his sisters were all stony-faced. They sat next to each other in the front row of the family canopy, next to their father. The canopy was beige and brown and tilted left, as though it couldn't make up its mind if it wanted to stand or fall. Everyone expected them to lead the crying, but they were calm, stoic even. August did not know what to read in those faces. Only later in life, after he had been blessed with the gift of a defiant young mind, would he realize what his sister's faces said, that a woman's children would pay their mother's dues. That night, after the funeral, his sisters traded stories of their grandmother. Those are part of August's memories too. That Thursday in May 1989, his grandmother said something that made his mother bend over the stove and weep. He was in that kitchen. He was sitting on the fridge or standing by the door. After Peculiar was born, when his grandmother wondered out aloud why a woman would only give birth to girls and still refuse to die or allow her husband to marry someone else, August was sitting next to his tired mother as she cried onto the baby she cradled in her arms. He remembered, too, the laugh of triumph that came to his grandmother when she heard that her son's wife had borne a son and now slept in death. August grew to resent his grandmother, even in her death. It was one of those things he kept hidden within himself and away from the fuzzy ears of his sisters. He imagined they would break if they knew there was space in his heart for resentment. They allowed him no vices, not even the ones they allowed themselves. August, always, was the beautiful pure baby their mother left them. A parting gift, a promise fulfilled, something to nurture. And so, they shielded him as much they could from things like hate, things that could hinder a beautiful boy from growing into a beautiful man. But there was only so much salvation a boy could suckle at the feet of his sisters. Only so much. At night, when he closed his eyes, August saw his mother's face, heard her voice, looked into her eyes, felt the heaviness of her sacrifice, and woke up plagued with feelings of unworthiness. He was not sure he was strong enough to be what he knew everyone expected. A perfect boy who would take the torch that was the family name and run his own race. He was not sure his frail bones were strong enough to bear the burden that was his name. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, every novel has an origin story, some moment when you realize that you have interesting characters and you want to tell their story. And so what is the origin story of Lullaby?
It's actually a bit complicated because, so I was working I had moved from where I was schooling in Enugu to Port Harcourt to work. I was in an internship as a medical laboratory scientist. And one day there was this baby that was born in the hospital that had basically the symptoms of August as a baby. And it kind of made, because, it's a very boring job, because most of it is basically paperwork, basically recording people's names and recording people's symptoms and what they have and stuff like that. And I occupy myself by imagining, lives for them. The people that are in troubled marriages and those that are trying to go abroad and, things like that. And I kind of started thinking about that baby and, what kind of could be their own origin story. And I just knew that, when I started thinking of August from there, it was such a compelling character that I was like, I definitely need to write this book.
That's amazing. So there you are looking at patient's information. We're like, who is this person? Who is this jaundiced little baby? How does Segun come into the narrative? And this is essentially a love story, and it's also a coming-of-age story for two young men. And so where did you go from imagining August as a baby and then seeing who he becomes as a young man, and then this love story that he makes with Segun?
Yeah. So in the first drafts, right, the story is told just completely from August's perspective, right? Because it was initially a story about August. But so because I am the type of writer that lets the story lead me where the story wants to lead me. And it was definitely a situation where, Segun grew from a supporting character to just a very compelling, almost, level of protagonist himself. And so I just knew I had to go back and, really look into like developing Segun's story as well, because it also became a situation where Segun's story was became very central to the book. That he was like, this isn't a supporting character, this is a protagonist. So I kind of went back and as I was writing the earlier chapters of Segun to kind of ask myself the hard questions of how I think an adult like Segun got to where he is, right? What kind of childhood, what kind of family, what kind of class background produces a person like that. And I was writing that it kind of made sense to kind of alternate, basically show the world from both their perspectives as opposed to just from one person. So,
it's really interesting in that you wrote the very first draft of this novel by hand, and as someone with extraordinarily bad handwriting and no patience for that kind of nonsense, I would love to know, how do you stay with it, writing, thousands, tens of thousands of words by hand, and then you dictated it into your phone, and then eventually put it into a Microsoft Word file. And so I would love to know about your writing process and how you go from ideas into a book that people will eventually read.
Yeah. Coming from a very, poor background, I didn't have a laptop even when I was in uni. So most of my short stories, I would write them out and then type them on my phone and then edit them on my phone. So when I decided to write August, I bought a long notebook. It was 80 leaves long notebook. And I wrote chapter 1. And when you start writing and you are, when you start the book immediately, there's a lot of excitement. But then you really start getting, your hand starts, aching quite a bit. Your hand starts aching and you have to kind of take breaks and stuff like that. But it was, I really believe that it was because I was so obsessed with the story of August and where it would lead me. Because I'm a very, character and plot driven type of writer. And I like to allow my my stories to actually surprise me as well. Because it's I do know this person, but I'm not so sure where they would end up. So I'm also very interested to see where they end up. So I just kept writing and kept writing. And to be very honest, I think that the actual paper writing wasn't really the hardest part of the writing. I think that would be typing it into my phone. That was really
I can actually see that because I'm old and that phone keyboard is very small.
Yeah, it is quite small. And there's also this thing where so Word documents on the phone, when the text starts getting much more larger, it starts to like hang, like when you want to type. So it wasn't, I had to create a different document for every single chapter, and then it like actually type it chapter by chapter and edit chapter by chapter, and then like copy and paste and like compile them. So it was it was quite a bit.
I mean, that's a commitment.
And it paid off. So
yeah, it did. It worked out. When you do that, though, does it allow you to revise as you're putting the new text into the new Word file and then the Word files pulling them together? Did that help you to sort of advance where you wanted to take the story?
Yes. So because I'm also like writing it down on pen and paper. Sometimes like as I maybe I'm in say chapter 11, and while writing chapter 11, I kind of come across something that I realize would necessitate me to add things in like chapter 3, right? And then I go to chapter 4 and like scribble on, like add this. So like when I'm actually down typing it in, that's where I go in and like, because it gives you a more removed, more editorial like perspective on the work when you actually like type it like that. I mean, it's I wouldn't do it again if I had the choice. It's very similar, but it has its own perks. So,
when did you first start writing and know that writing was something you wanted to be part of your life?
I can't say because I was too young to like know when that happened. It's kind of like as you grow up as a child, you just realize that you write, right? You don't realize when you started writing because you are too young to kind of like mark. But it was also because I also come from a very story-oriented culture. Like Igbo culture is very, very grounded in oral histories. And so storytelling was, from the very beginning, very, very like a central part of like my upbringing. I mean, my parents didn't like tell me oral stories and things like that, but they did buy like collection of like Igbo folklore and things like that. And also like, but because as much as we didn't have means so much, my parents are also very, very like committed to like kind of having us develop a reading culture, because that's what how they call it, is like develop a reading culture. Like look at your mates, they're always like reading, and for them it was a more general like always read type of thing. But for me it was a very much like I want to read specifically like stories. Like it wasn't just about like a reading culture, it was about like being very fascinated by fiction and by stories and by how they like can transport you to places and help you escape whatever unhappiness that you are dealing with at the time. So I always kind of wrote, and I remember I would even tell my siblings like stories at some certain times, and I would make up really fantastical stories like out of this world level. Level of stories, and because they are my siblings, it was kind of like an interactive storytelling where sometimes they'll be like, hold on, this doesn't make sense, and I'll be like, okay, maybe this is how it happened. So it was kind of, yeah.
What were some of your influences as you developed this storytelling? In addition to Igbo folklore, what else shaped you, and what were some of your favorite stories?
Yeah. Definitely, the classics like Flora Wapa and Chinua Achebe, and there are also some, very Western novels that I may not be able to remember some of the authors, but Mills and Boons and Harlequin novels. But I do remember Dora Roberts at least, so I definitely remember Dora Roberts. So those kind of also, because you read wherever you can get your hands on at that point, because it's not like you could just go buy books that you want to read. So any book that you could find, you just yeah. So.
Wait a second. I did write my questions down. So I know that you're an activist and you're very invested in queer liberation, not only in Nigeria, but I would think everywhere. And so when you say that you're a queer liberation activist, what does that mean and what are you striving for?
So I started using queer liberation activists because I don't really like the term of LGBT rights activists or gay rights, because mostly they just say gay rights activists, and I feel that that's very narrow, right? Because when we define, or the way that activism is defined, or that type of activism is defined, it's very limited to legal rights and decriminalization and this and decriminalization is very important, right? But as someone who comes from quite a poor home, I just know it's just possibly isn't enough, right? Because it wouldn't matter to someone, a queer person, that now you queer people are no longer, let's say tomorrow, right? Nigerian government, or maybe a court strikes out the SSMPA, right? It would still be, just as much a precarious situation when someone comes out and now they're homeless, or they can't afford education, or they can't afford healthcare. So it becomes a situation where I believe that activism should be holistic, right? I believe in struggling for everything that we need as a community to be safe and to thrive, right? Not just because I don't want to be equal to cisgender heterosexuals, because they're not free either, right? They're literally being locked up and they're being shot by the police as well, and they're being, they're being crushed under brutal poverty and imperialist destruction. And when I look at them, I don't see people that are free either, right? And even in terms of gender, because in as much as gender and sexuality and heterosexuality and cisgenderism as basically the default in society, in as much as it is meant to oppress queer people, it also cages cisgender people as well, because they also basically build their life around maintaining a particular straight path and never being able to explore, and always having to prove, particularly for men, right, prove their masculinity by enforcing masculinity of every other man that they meet, right? Because if a group of men are in this room, for instance, and there's one guy that isn't really conforming to how men are quote unquote supposed to behave, it would be necessary for the preservation of the masculinity of the other men for them to point that out and relentlessly bully the other person and kind of explain to them that they are lower on the hierarchy, because they need that hierarchy to basically even feel good about themselves. So I feel queer liberation is about understanding that there are quite a lot of structures, of oppression that goes beyond just this or that law, or and that we need to actually look at it quite holistically, right? Because it's not that, in as much as discrimination is very, very essential part of any activism, basically the fight against discrimination is kind of a core tenet. It's also a situation that there are some things that aren't discrimination that are still quite oppressive. Or you would, even if sorry, just need to gather my thoughts. Even if you live in a situation where there's more kind of legal equality, particularly in Western countries, you also see that when you look at the rates of homelessness of queer youth and of a lack of access to healthcare and things like that, it becomes very apparent that that isn't enough. So it doesn't make any sense for us to kind of start the negotiation there. I feel you should don't negotiate yourself down, just go all the way. And yeah, so.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that first attracted me to the novel, in addition to the first chapter, which was so beautiful, and just the whole novel is beautifully written, you guys are gonna love it. was that it had a lot of political ambition. And Segun in particular is very politically motivated, and he is, and this is not a spoiler, I don't think, he's unwilling to sacrifice his politics to make anyone else happy. And that's a very challenging thing to do for anyone, but particularly in the context that he's living in, it's very difficult. And so, you know, one of the challenges when writing politics into fiction is finding the balance between storytelling and advancing your political ambitions. So how do you think about balancing politics and narrative as you're writing?
So it was also a concern for me, because I didn't want it to be like I was just preaching, right? But at the same time, I also wanted, because Segun, to be quite honest, isn't like an average Nigerian person, right? People aren't really that ideological in Nigeria. Even like, regardless of gender expression or sexual orientation, people aren't that ideological. But I am, and I really wanted to write a character that I was as well, because like, maybe we are not the norm, but we do exist. So I wanted to, but you know, it was like, Segun's life was in such a way that he didn't really, it was kind of easy, right, to write about his politics, because he just kind of flowed easily into that. Like if you started reading, when you start reading the, you know, his part from chapter 3, right, and you see what he goes through as a child, it becomes obvious that that is the adult he's going to grow up into, particularly given like the background and, you know, the politics of his parents, right? Because I feel like my mom also kind of really influenced the kind of man I grew up to be, with the way that she was very, you know, engaged in like union activism and kind of, you know, very, very much against like things that she didn't, like when she didn't believe in something, she was very, very like vocal and serious about like, you know, her displeasure about it. And I also feel like there's a lot of unhappiness that comes with, I like to call it fatalism, that exists in Nigerian politics, particularly for, you know, minorities and marginal, like poor people in Nigeria, because it's like, it just seems like there is no hope in sight, right? It seems like you are being oppressed, there are laws that like criminalize you, and it's not moving in your direction. Like more laws are being introduced to even further criminalize you. Like, so it's very, very much like a hopeless thing. And I find that it gave me quite a lot of solace to actually like just completely throw myself into like opposing that, because I came to the conclusion that you can't really self-love yourself out of a society that despises you, right? It becomes like a necessity to demand that your society loves you back. It's like, I'm not going to, you know, stay here pretending like I can like stand in front of the mirror and affirm myself to happiness, right? It's like actually having a society that values and loves me is a need as well, and it's my right. And if that doesn't exist now, I have to like demand it, like because it's my right, right? So I don't concede that, oh, this is how things are. It's kind of like someone just took something from me and then I want it back, like give it back. So that kind of, you know, helps, because even if you are not, even if it's still, you know, things still look the way it is, your life kind of has purpose, right? Because it's like, at least I know my words and I'm actually like demanding that words be accorded to me. So that's kind of like how, you know, I kind of, because it was very hard writing Segun, because I put a lot of my own self.
I thought you might.
So
it can be hard to put yourself into a book like that and, you know, make sure that you are creating enough separation between the character and you. And you've written this book, it's actually going to be published in Nigeria. And I imagine that that's a double-edged sword in some ways, because it makes you more visible in a culture where homosexuality is, or queerness and broadly, is criminalized. but at the same time, your book is being published at home.
Yes.
And so how do you navigate that tension?
So it's one of those things that there's just no getting around it, right? I mean, I became, notable for queer activism even before I became known for writing fiction. And a lot of the times people always are like, why don't you wait till you go abroad, or why are you kind of making yourself a target, quote unquote? And there's this kind of like transferring of blame onto me, like I am making myself a target, which is like, I'm pretty sure I'm just living my life, like I'm just existing. And it's a situation where, when you live in a state of criminality like that, it's not possible to fight it without putting yourself in danger, quote unquote. Like it's just not possible to fight it in a way that is completely safe, right? So it becomes a thing where you have to basically try to do due diligence of, I have fulfilled all the safety precautions I can, right? I mean, it's probably still not enough, but it's no longer in my hand at this point. I've done what I can do, but also it's like I do need to do this, right? Because I feel like the book wouldn't really be, the publicity from the book, I don't think it would be that challenging for me, because I'm already, I was a co-convener of Homophobia in Nigeria. I was, part of the NSAS protest, like with Square Lives Matter placards in Enugu. I organized a protest, a physical protest in Abuja to oppose an amendment that would have jailed people for wearing clothes that don't match the sex that they are assigned at birth. So it's a situation where I already I'm quite used to the kind of people like being very horrible and sending you death threats and things like that. So it's like what out of a dog's mouth basically, right? I mean, it still gets to me, but it's like there's a level of it gets to me, but it doesn't get to me that much anymore because I've kind of built up like a hide for it. So
it's interesting how you can build up an immunity or a thicker skin to these things, but it's also one of those things where you think, why? Why do I have to?
Yeah.
I'm sure this audience has questions for you, so I'd love to open it up to the audience if you have questions for Kayode. So just throw a hand up. Oh, Maria. Maria's my student from Rutgers.
Hi, I really enjoyed all of your responses. I thought they were amazing. I actually was curious because when you were introduced, they said you wrote in multiple languages through writing. Do you ever feel like you're writing in different voices when it's like in different languages, or have you ever had to translate your writing from one language to another, and is there like difficulty doing that? You can't get the meaning across, or a way you do to get the meaning across?
Well, so you actually asked like two different questions. So, but I'll get through all of them. So first of all, it's a situation where I kind of think in English when I'm writing at this point, because in Nigeria all the language of instruction is English. So like all my education, like even when you read books to write exams, everything is in English. You read novels and it's all in English and stuff like that. So when you are writing Igbo, the language I write in as well, in addition to English, is Igbo. And when I'm writing Igbo, sometimes it's a situation where I find myself like thinking in English instead of like thinking in Igbo, right? But the thing as well is, when I finish writing Igbo, I try to translate it into English, and that's quite hard because English is nowhere near as expressive as Igbo, like not even close at all. So there are some things that, you can't get a translation, but you know that it doesn't do what you wrote justice. So it could be hard doing that as well. But I love, the reason why I also write in Igbo as well is that it's such an important and such an expressive language to me. There are forms of expression that I just can't do in English because let me use an example, right? If you wanted to say I love you in English, that is I love you, right? Or I care for you, or something like that. If you wanted to say it in Igbo, it's more of Afro-Nginaya, and it's like I see you with my eyes. There is a very deep poetry, right, to it that kind of like English just cannot, encompass that.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I write in Creole, there are things that simply don't translate, and so I just don't translate it. And either you are going to Google it and try and figure it out, or you're just going to sort of use context clues and figure it out. And I know one of the things we talked about during the editorial process was when and where do you engage in cultural translation? And more often than not, the choice was no. If people really care, if they're really invested, they will do the work to understand what he's saying.
Yeah.
And I thought that was one of the most important parts of editing the book, was to recognize that as Western readers, it is our responsibility to put in some work. And I would say this for anyone from any culture. Like, part of reading is like doing that intellectual work. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it in that manner.
I was quite grateful for that because being signed by like a major, US publisher, I was coming to the editorial process like kind of expecting to fight. Like I knew it was Roxane. I knew it was Roxane, so knowing her work, I thought like she would be understanding, but I still expected like some attempts to, but it was something I was like very willing to fight on because in the end, I wrote the book specifically for Nigerian queer people and more generally for African queer people. And obviously I'm very like pleased that you can find an audience anywhere, right? But I wouldn't want to change and edit it for that anywhere. I would want them to experience it the way I wrote it for my people. So I was very, very, because if you read the book, a lot of the dialogue is very Nigerian, it is English. And to be honest, I think that if you read it carefully, it's understandable, right? It's not something that you can't follow, right? If you just, so.
Yes, you can follow, and it's great to get that cultural cadence that you wouldn't otherwise get. Other questions? Yes.
So hi, I'm also Igbo, and I moved to the US for college, and I think it's like incredibly brave what you've done so far, and like stood steadfast in your identity, and also like your attitude towards like Nigerian politics. It is true, we're very fatalist about our country and where we stand, and I'm just so proud and so grateful for you and all the work you've done. And I was just wondering, in terms of like publishing your book in Nigeria, what that process looked like, what obstacles were in the way, how easy it is to like, I guess, distribute the book as well, like amongst different publishers, and like so far what the reception has been too.
Yes. So the book is not out in Nigeria yet, right? But the publishing process was kind of it was quite easier than I expected because I was very lucky that I did get a good publisher that was also very involved and very like also cared about the political kind of aspects of it. Like the publishing philosophy isn't just, oh, we make good books that you like reading. They also like actually care about like the politics of it, which is Cassava Republic. And I feel like that kind of helped, with the whole, because there's some things that I didn't have to like argue on, right? Like there maybe an opportunity for a promotional, and I'll be like, I have, ideological reservations about working with this particular news outlets, and they would be like, that's totally fine. There wouldn't be any, kind of, and in Nigeria there's quite a bit of like a lot of the outlets that are very, very like problematic that you would that you wouldn't really, because Nigeria is just quite a very like unique a very unique place, right? But as well, it was a situation where like the kind of great feedback I'm getting in Nigeria now kind of came because my book was already published and was already had a Western publisher, right? So because after writing the book, I first sent it to like a few agents and some Nigerian publishers, and most of the Nigerian publishers I sent it to actually just didn't even reply at all. Like they didn't even send me a rejection. And then one of them was like, oh, we can't publish this at this time. It's not because your work is bad. It's just, that kind of like form rejection letter, right? But then after and in a way I do understand this, right? Because the level of, legal hurdles basically to jump through, and the way that you could really run into trouble publishing a book like that, right? Obviously, the author, I don't mind, right? But for a publisher, if they're running a business, so they're kind of also kind of worrying about the business side of it. So it was kind of that kind of, maybe you people wouldn't reply now, but I'm very sure that this book is going to get published, and I was right, so.
Yes, and the book came to me through the unagented submission queue because I accept unagented submissions. And my assistant at the time, Sinclair, they read the manuscript and wrote this amazing reader report, and they were like, you absolutely need to read this right now. And they were correct. I did, and I bought it that week. And so sometimes the gatekeepers do open the gates a little bit. We have time for one last question, and then Kayode will sign books. Yes.
Hi, Kayode. My name is Valley. I actually had a question for you because you mentioned that you have a degree in biotech and you did things with, medical laboratory sciences and things like that. As a fellow person who works in sciences and, moonlights as an artist, I'm just curious to know what are your next steps? Do you intend on continuing in the science industry? Do you intend on writing more? I'm just curious to know what your next steps are and if you try to balance those things. Also kind of curious to know what your family thinks about your writing career. Do they think that's something that's worth achieving? Because I find a lot of families are like, oh yeah, no, you need to go to the sciences, you can't be an artist.
So my parents really, really wanted me to be a doctor. They really wanted me to be a doctor. And I also wanted to be a doctor. And I got into medical school actually. But it was a situation where I was also very much like, I don't really want to be a doctor. I'm actually more interested in research specifically, which you could do with a medical degree, but you don't really need a medical degree to do it. So I switched to applied biology. But I just have never thought of it to be in contention with writing, right? Because I was raised in a background that made me never even think of writing as a career, right? I always thought of writing as, oh, this is something I really, really love doing. So I do it for fun, and I do it because I love doing it. And even if I never, got published, I would have still continued writing, right? But it's a situation where, now that writing has also kind of overtaking, kind of taking me in its own direction. I'm no longer so certain about my career path. It's a situation where I have 3 different career paths that I know I would love doing, right? And I can maybe merge at the most 2 of them, right? And of course, writing has to be one of them because I do intend to continue writing, right? So I also I might actually pursue, because I wanted to further in immunology after, I actually got into school too. I got into the University of Nottingham to do a master's in immunology and immunotherapy, but they didn't give me funding and I couldn't afford to go. And it's possible that I could, because I could decide to, try to get in again, right? But as well, I also have research interest in social sciences as well, right? So it's the possibilities are basically endless. So.
Oh, to be young. Kayode, thank you so much for joining us here at Brookline Booksmith.